had some requests lately for some more crochet specific videos, including tutorials on some more intermediate techniques. But one of those requests was for a sort of yarn 101, which I think it makes a lot of sense to start with, since that's obviously quite a foundational topic. This video may have been requested by a crocheter, but it does of course apply to knitting just the same, and I'll be using both crafts as examples throughout. We are going to demystify yarn weights, yarn fibres, forms you can buy yarn in, and not to mention all of that bump you get on a yarn ball band. So settle in, because this is going to be a lot of info, hopefully efficiently explained. If you're new here, by the way, hello! My name is Michelle and I do all of the crafts, but especially the stitchy ones. If you like cross-stitch, yarn crafts and all of that good stuff with just a little bit of experimental mess making thrown in, this might just be the channel for you. Okay, let's start at the start with gauge. I wanted to talk about the concept of gauge first because a lot of the other things we're going to discuss affect it, and so understanding what that means is really important. If you do already know all about gauge, no worries, skip to this timestamp below. When you knit or crochet, you're creating a piece of fabric one stitch at a time. Gauge is the count of how many stitches and how many rows it takes you to create a bit of fabric a certain size. 99.9% of the time you're going to see this measured over a 10cm or 4-inch square. If you knitted this exact same piece with the exact same yarn and even the exact same needle, you might get a completely different gauge, and that's because a lot of it depends on your personal tension. Using a different size needle or hook or using a different thickness of yarn is obviously also going to affect gauge. Fatter stitches mean less of them per 4 inches, this makes sense. But why is this so important for you to understand straight away? Well, imagine you're making a pattern where the designer asks you to crochet 200 stitches across. The gauge they've given is 20 stitches across per 4 inches. We can easily work out that the intent is for those 200 stitches to equal 40 inches wide. But let's say the gauge you're getting with the recommended yarn and hook size is actually 22 stitches per 4 inches. That's close enough, right? Well, now your 200 stitches are only going to make a piece that's about 36 inches across. That's a full 10% smaller, which can easily be the difference between a garment fitting or not, a blanket being big enough to be practical, and so on. So what should you do if your gauge is different to the one the pattern calls for? Well, you could adjust the pattern itself, but as you might imagine, that's going to get complicated real fast. So it makes more sense to adjust your gauge to meet the pattern, and usually you'll do that by changing your hook or needle size. Personally, I'm a very loose crocheter. My stitches are quite big, so I very rarely meet the designer's gauge. But going down a hook size or two fixes this for me 9 times out of 10. This is why we make what's called a gauge swatch before starting a project. It's a way to check that we are getting the correct number of stitches and rows. Sometimes it's tedious. Okay, it's always tedious. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 swatches to find a hook and yarn combo that gets you the right result. But if the dimensions of the finished piece are important, so is getting this part right. As you can see, there are lots of variables that affect gauge, which is why I said it's going to come up a lot. We'll continue to discuss it as we go, but that should give you a rough idea. Yarn weight. This is essentially how thick your yarn is, and it affects things like what needle or hook size you'll use with it, what sort of projects it's suitable for, and of course your gauge. Here are some common yarn weights. From thinnest to thickest we have lace weight, fingering, DK, which stands for double knit, Aran, and chunky. Now, these aren't all the available weights, they're just some I had around for this demonstration, but hopefully you can see the difference pretty clearly there. Confusion often stems from the fact that different countries will often use different terms for the same thing. For example, I just called this fingering, but in the UK you will often see it referred to as four-ply. I'll put up a table here of some of the closest equivalents, but if you're learning this stuff on the internet, chances are the US terms are the ones you're going to become most familiar with. If you also happen to be in the UK, the big one to know from the start is that if you see a pattern calling for US worsted, that's roughly equivalent to our UK Aran. And as a side note, this brings us back to gauge already, because gauge is the important thing here. If a pattern calls for worsted and you use Aran, which is actually very slightly thicker than worsted, you might have to change needle size to get the correct gauge. But as long as you do get that correct gauge, you're all good. Even though the internet does mostly stick to US terms, it's always useful to know your local ones, because local shops to you might be using them, and also you don't want to end up like newbie me, sitting on the floor of Hobbycraft close to tears, trying to Google why you can't find anything called worsted. Thinner yarns create smaller stitches, which creates drapier fabric. Compare this fingering weight cardigan pattern with this bulky weight one and you'll hopefully see what I mean. If you're creating something to be worn against the skin, bigger stitches from thicker yarns might feel more noticeable, and that may or may not be something that you're comfortable with. And between the stiffer fabric and the physically fatter stitches, a jumper made from bulky weight yarn is potentially going to be a bit less flattering than one made from a thinner weight. Of course, the bulky one is going to take a lot less time to make because it needs way fewer stitches to make the same size garment. So we can start to get a feel for why certain yarn weights are more popular with certain types of project and the trade-offs involved. One handy trick to know is that for most of the common yarn weights, you can use 2 strands of the same weight to create an approximation of the next weight up. For example, I'm just about to start knitting an emotional support chicken, and the pattern calls for worsted, so I should really have been shopping for Aran weight yarn. But the one that stole my heart is DK weight, so actually I'm going to knit this with 2 strands, which gets me the correct gauge for a full-size chicken. Yarn fibres. Okay, there are lots of things that yarn could be made from really common fibres like wool and cotton to viscose and silk and the yarn spinner's own cat's fur. So I can't cover all of the possibilities, and frankly there are some of them I'd just rather not think about. But here's the brief version. Different fibres have different properties, so a yarn made from acrylic is going to be different to a yarn made from wool, which is going to be different again from an acrylic wool mix. Let's go through some pros and cons and general project suitability of some of the really common fibres. Wool is very warm and insulating, and it can be very hard wearing depending on the type, but bear in mind there are quite a few different types of wool. It can be used for really cool techniques like felting because of the physical structure of the fibres. But sometimes it can require delicate care, perhaps even hand washing, to avoid accidental felting or shrinkage. It can be quite rough on the skin, again it kind of depends on the type of wool, and it can also be quite sticky in the sense that the actual strands of it will stick to each other, which means it's more difficult to rip out mistakes. It's not generally my go-to for beginners just based on that alone. Of course, there's also the issue that some people can be quite seriously allergic. One very big upside for wool though is that it blocks extremely well. If you don't know what that means, blocking is a way of getting your piece to take on its final form. It opens up the stitches and lace patterns and just makes everything lie nice. See these before and after blocking examples for a general idea of the effect. With wool, pretty much all you need to do is wet the piece and then pin it into shape and let it dry that way. Super easy. Some examples of good wool projects then would be shawls because of that ease of blocking. Socks because it's hard wearing. General outerwear to keep you toasty warm. Now acrylic yarn is very cheap. It's stretchy, it's super forgiving for beginners, but it's also non-breathable, which means wearing it against your skin can get unpleasantly sweaty. And it's essentially plastic, which means it is possible to melt it with too much heat. On top of this, it doesn't block super well. It is possible to do, but that's a whole other topic, so for now, it's just more complicated than with wool. Some good acrylic projects would be accessories like hats, gloves, scarves. These don't tend to get very sweaty, so acrylic is just fine. Blankets are a very popular acrylic project. Things like cardigans that aren't going to be worn directly against your skin. Cotton is absorbent and easy to wash and care for. Stitches made with it are pleasingly tidy and sturdy and strong. It's also breathable, light and comfortable to wear. But beware! Large pieces made from cotton can get very heavy, especially if they get wet. So long garments or big blankets can really stretch out of shape over time due to that weight. Cotton is also quite a stiff, non-stretchy yarn, and some people do find that aggravates their wrist pain. Some good cotton projects would be washcloths, coasters, general household stuff, things that you probably are going to need to wash. Toys, bags, baby garments, summer tops. Those are the big 3, but obviously there are all kinds of yarn out there. Fibres like silk and bamboo can add drape and a beautiful sheen. Special sock yarns tend to mix wool with something like nylon, making them much longer lasting when you're walking around on them all the time. And there are all sorts of speciality and novelty yarns out there too. To an extent, it just takes experience to know what you like working with. For example, I used linen yarn one time, and it will be the only time, because as much as I love the top it made, the stiffness of the yarn just was absolute havoc on my wrists. I also try and avoid most wools if I'm making something that's going to sit on certain parts of my skin, because I have sensitive patches that just will not cope with it at all. On the other hand, those same sensitive patches are completely fine if it happens to be specifically merino wool, so things you can only learn by experimenting. Patterns will generally recommend a specific brand of yarn, but other than the weight, which we already went over, the important thing to look at is the fibre content. The designer has already chosen the fibre that they think will work best for their pattern based on its properties, so it makes sense to use that when you are thinking of substituting a different yarn. Swap acrylic with acrylic, cotton with cotton, merino wool with merino wool, etc, etc. At least until you're a bit more confident. And I do just want to mention superwash yarns here as well, because I do see some newbies running into trouble with those. Basically what superwash means is that the fibres have been specially treated in such a way that means you can put that yarn through a normal wash cycle as opposed to having to hand wash it or whatever. And that's great, but it does come with some downsides, and most notably, gauge. Yeah, we're back on that. Everything affects gauge. The thing with gauge is that washing and blocking your piece can affect it quite a lot as the yarn relaxes or fluffs up or does whatever it is your particular yarn does when it gets wet. Which is why the recommendation is to wash and block your swatch the same way you will the finished piece and then measure your gauge. I'm definitely not saying we all do this, but it is the recommended way, okay? And I'm just mentioning this here because superwash yarns can have a tendency to grow so much when they are washed and blocked that it full-on ruins projects for the unsuspecting. I'm definitely not telling you to avoid superwash, it can be really great when used right, but just take a bit of extra care at the swatching stage. Make sure you do wash it and see how that yarn is going to behave in your final project. Yarn colourways. Yes, that's colourway, not colour. See, this is a golden yellow coloured yarn. Simple enough. But what colour is this? It's mostly dark blue, but also there's orange and cream, and yeah, there can be a lot of different colours involved in a specific colourway. It's basically just a way of referring to the colour scheme as a whole. And there are different kinds to watch out for. Solid colourways like this, what you see is what you get. It's going to make a solid colour piece. But then we have variegated colourways, which just means more than one colour, basically. This is variegated, this is variegated, and you can see already there are different levels of variegation, which is where the term semi-solid comes in, as a way to refer to quite subtle variegation that just adds a little bit of oomph. These can work up very differently on different types and sizes of project, so do be prepared for a bit of trial and error if you are using them. They're very pretty though. Love a good variegated yarn. You'll see gradient yarns, speckle or flecked yarns, tweed yarns, and I'd never used one before, but you can see this is actually a twist yarn, where one ply of it is variegated and they're twisted around each other for a cool effect. Looking forward to seeing how that one knits up. There is often a certain amount of just try it and see in knowing how a particular yarn is going to work up. You can often find examples online from other people who've used it, but if you're lucky enough to live near a yarn shop, they will often also have swatches of some of their yarns knitted up already. So it's always worth giving those a look if you have the option, just to get a feel for the different kinds. Balls and skeins and hanks, oh my! This might sound like a weird one, but a lot of newbies, myself included back in the day, get kind of confused between all of the different forms and shapes that yarn comes in. For example, here we have a ball, or a donut depending where you're from, a skein, a cake, and a hank. Oh, and I've just remembered I've got a cone here somewhere as well. A hank is the only one that comes with extra steps. All of these others, you could just pick them up in a shop, come home, and start swatching. A lot of higher end yarns come in hanks, so it might not be something you encounter straight away, but these do come with the additional step of needing to be wound before use. I'm only going to say this once, please do not be tempted to work straight from the hank. It will end in tears. You have been warned. Personally, I have a very cheap Swift and ball winder setup that I use to make these cakes from hank yarn. But if the cost of that is an issue, you can use a helpful assistant or the back of a chair to hold your yarn and then wind it by hand. There are plenty of tutorials out there. For now, just know if you're looking at one in a shop, hanks do come with this extra manual step, so bear it in mind if you are impatient. Reading a yarn ball band. Alright, so you're standing in a shop, you found a skein of likely looking yarn, but the ball band has just so much info on it, you are way over your head. Don't worry, I got you. I'll put up some examples to show that bands come in all sorts of layouts, but they will generally include the same info. Obviously the yarn brand and the name, but also the fibre content, so you can compare between like types. It's going to have the weight of the skein and the length, usually in both yards and metres, so you can be sure to buy enough for your pattern. Care instructions? Do pay attention to this because it's really crap to accidentally buy hand wash only when you didn't mean to. Then you'll usually have a recommended needle and hook size, and a guide to what gauge you can expect if you use that size. But remember, gauge depends on your personal tension as well, so you might not get an exact match for what it says on the ball band, even if you use the recommended hook or needle. Think of this more as a way to compare different yarns and make sure they're at least intended to work up roughly the same way. You'll also have a colourway on there. Sometimes it's just a name and sometimes a number. Often you will get both. And then the dye lot as well, which is basically a batch number, so you know skeins with the same dye lot were made at the same time. Dye lots become really important if you're using multiple balls of the same colourway. You probably want them to all be the same colour, and your best chance of that is if they are all the same dye lot. Dye effects can vary quite a bit from batch to batch, especially with smaller or indie dyers, but even with the big boys as well. And the last thing you want is a really obvious colour change halfway down your jumper. This is why it's really important to buy enough yarn for your project all in one go, so that you don't end up having to try and track down the exact dye lot later. If you use an app or a site like Ravelry to record your stash, make sure to make a note of the dye lot just in case you need it. Or if you're too lazy for that like me, just snap a photo of the ball band with your phone, that works too. If you do find yourself needing more yarn in future, having that dye lot number will at least give you a chance of being able to find an exact match. Recommendations for beginners. Okay, if you've watched this video all the way through, you probably are more on the beginner side. So here are just a few tips for selecting your first yarn. Obviously, feel free to just jump in and go with your gut if that's the sort of person you are, but if you are feeling a bit nervous about this, I can just make it a little easier. You'll want to stick to solid colour or at least very, very lightly variegated yarn. And pick something in a lightish colour as well. Not bright white, but just lightish. This makes it so much easier to see your stitches, and it really reduces the frustration in those early stages. I have seen it play out so many times. You'll also want to pick something without too much texture to it. So for example, most acrylic yarns are going to be quite smooth like this. Merino wool or cotton, again, very smooth. Avoid novelty yarns, but also avoid anything that's really fuzzy or tweedy or has any kind of lumps. As before, that's just going to make it a lot easier to see what you're doing and also to pick out any mistakes if you do need to try a bit over again. Avoid those fancy hanks for now. I know they are pretty, but the last thing you need is to be worrying about extra equipment when you're just learning. The yarn weight you need is going to depend on your project, but if you haven't picked a project yet, try and go for one that uses worsted/Aran weight, as again, it's just so much easier to see what's what. DK is also acceptable, but you do just want to stick to that mid-range of weights there if possible. Alright, I think that should be basically everything you need to know about yarn as a complete beginner. Of course, get your tips down in the comments if you think I missed something, and if you have a follow-up question, those are very welcome too. We do have a Discord server full of people ready to answer your questions, coo over your beginner projects, and generally cheer you on. If that sounds fun, the link will be down in the description. Thank you so much to my Ko-fi supporters for helping me make hopefully useful videos like this, and especially to the extra cool members of the Stitch Squad, who currently are Mary Ann Johnson, Sunny, Candy Riley Pettinger, Laura Salets, Enlightened Flamingo, Cross Stitch the Globe, I'd Rather Be Stitching, Angela Sue Harrison, Emily Hobbs, Lee the Cozy Crafter, Asta Vinka, Callie Jenny, Sarah, Angela Wells, and Enraged Flamingo. I'll be back soon with some more crafty nonsense, so in the meantime, have a brilliant rest of your day and keep making cool stuff.